Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Jackie Cabasso. I'm the Executive Director of Western States Legal Foundation in Oakland, California, where it is 10 past 10 in the morning. I'm a founding mother and coordinating committee member of the Abolition 2000 Global Network to Eliminate Nuclear Weapons, which was founded nearly 25 years ago during the 1995 NPT Review and Extension Conference to call for immediate commencement of negotiations on a verifiable treaty to eliminate nuclear weapons within a time-bound framework. This is our first webinar, and I'm very pleased to report that more than 135 people have registered from Australia, Bangladesh, Belgium, Brazil, Cameroon, Chile, Czech Republic, Germany, Finland, France, Italy, Japan, Kenya, Mexico, Pakistan, Scotland, Sweden, the US, the UK, and Russia, though most of the people who registered are from the US. On January 25th of last year, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved the hands of its doomsday clock to 2 minutes to midnight, as close as it's ever been set since its inception in 1947, citing the failure of world leaders to deal with looming threats of nuclear war and climate change, and stating the world is not only more dangerous now than it was a year ago, it is as threatening as it has been since World War II. US President Trump's announced intention to withdraw the United States from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF treaty, is another sign of deepening crisis among the nuclear-armed states. Following the 2002 US withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, it imperils the entire structure of arms control and disarmament, including prospects for extension of the New START Treaty, which expires in 2021, and could lead to new unpredictable rounds of arms racing. Our webinar is very timely. A week from today, on January 24th, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists will announce where the hands of the doomsday clock now stand. It's worth reflecting that on that same date, January 24th, but in 1946, the United Nations General Assembly adopted by consensus its very first resolution, which established a commission of the UN Security Council to ensure the elimination from national armaments of atomic weapons and all other major weapons adaptable to mass destruction. It seems that the nuclear-armed states are going in the opposite direction. Our webinar is scheduled to last an hour and a half. It will be recorded and the link will be sent to all of you. If you do not want your face to appear in the recording, please turn off your camera. You were sent instructions about how to use Zoom in advance, but if you need help during the webinar, please write your question in the chat box. Look for the symbol at the bottom of your screen. And you might want to keep that chat box opened as we will be posting documents as we go along. We will have 4 presentations, followed by an opportunity to ask questions. I'll introduce each of our 4 speakers in more detail before they speak, but they are Andrew Lichterman from the US, Pavel Podvig from Russia, Dave Webb from the United Kingdom, and Regina Hagen from Germany. I will be assisted with the controls by Abolition 2000 Coordinating Committee Tony Robinson and Abolition 2000 Coordinating Committee Secretary Malta Albrecht, who may speak up from time to time to assist. Everyone will be muted except for the speakers. And as this is our first webinar, I ask everybody to please bear with us if there are glitches. So I will now introduce our first speaker. Andrew Lichterman is a policy analyst and lawyer with the Oakland, California-based Western States Legal Foundation. He also serves on the boards of the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms and the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, and is a member of the Coordinating Committee of United for Peace and Justice. He has represented peace and environmental activists in a variety of settings and also taught at alternative law schools for many years. In recent years, his work has focused on the purposes and impacts of US weapons programs and on the relationship between nuclear technologies, militarism, and the global economy. Andrew is a member of the Abolition 2000 Global Council. Andy, the floor is yours.
All right, I'm going to start off with an overview of the treaty and recent developments. And then I want to talk a bit about the moment that gave rise to the treaty, including the movements that played a part in bringing it about, and their implications for our work today. So the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was signed by the United States and the Soviet Union in December 1987 and entered into force in June 1988. And the treaty prohibits the two countries from deploying both nuclear and conventional ground-launched cruise missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers, or about 310 to 3,420 miles. And it's worth noting at the time that few foresaw that the end of the Cold War and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union was imminent. In late October, President Trump announced the intent to withdraw from the treaty. And after consultation with NATO allies, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo stated that the U.S. would hold off on suspension of the treaty until early February. The main reason cited for withdrawal is that Russia has tested and deployed ground-launched cruise missiles that the treaty prohibits. Russia denies the missiles violate the treaty and also has made its own accusations, foremost being that U.S. ballistic missile defense in Eastern Europe could be used to house treaty-prohibited cruise missiles. The INF Treaty provides for a special verification commission. The commission is supposed to meet at the request of either party to resolve compliance issues. And since the U.S. first raised the current compliance issues in 2013, the commission has met twice, in late 2016 on the Obama administration, then again in late 2017. And there have been a number of other less formal contacts as well. Now, to the outside observer, these meetings did not appear to be very substantive efforts to resolve the dispute. Perhaps some of our other panelists who have more technical expertise might want to comment further on that. It should be noted that these contacts occurred in the climate of relations between the U.S. and Russia that declined sharply following the beginning of the Ukraine crisis in 2014. Since the Trump administration announced the U.S. intention to withdraw, the Russian government has on several occasions indicated its willingness to continue to negotiate with the United States to resolve the compliance issues. In December, Russia sponsored a United Nations General Assembly resolution calling for preservation of the treaty and for the two countries to consult on compliance. That resolution was rejected by the General Assembly in a vote in which abstentions nearly outnumbered the votes for or against. The day before yesterday, U.S. and Russian officials met in Geneva to discuss the status of the treaty. It was reported that the U.S. demanded that Russia destroy the cruise missiles in question, apparently without recourse to any further negotiation or verification. And the U.S. also dismissed Russian offers of inspections. Then there was a briefing at NATO in Brussels yesterday by Under-Secretary of State for Arms Control Andrea Thompson and U.S. Permanent NATO Representative Hutchinson. And their language was a bit murky, but really appeared to make it clear that the U.S. will initiate the withdrawal process on February 2nd. Now, the INF Treaty allows either party to withdraw on 6 months' notice if it decides that extraordinary events related to the subject matter of this treaty have jeopardized its supreme interests. But a dispute over compliance does not automatically authorize withdrawal. The Trump administration has firmly asserted that Russia has violated the treaty, and the NATO states have backed that assertion. But the administration really hasn't made the case that the missiles in question pose a threat that significantly affects the military balance between Russia and the very large and capable forces of the United States and its NATO allies, much less constituting an extraordinary development jeopardizing U.S. supreme interests. President Trump has also indicated that withdrawal is premised in part on a buildup of intermediate range missiles by China, which is not a party to the treaty. Here, too, no case has been made that these missiles, which are based in China's national territory, are best answered in kind by U.S. deployment of intermediate range missiles. Nor has it been demonstrated that peace and stability in that region or the world will be enhanced by repudiating the treaty, rather than seeking more comprehensive arms control measures aimed at breaking an emerging multipolar arms race. Further, in either Europe or Asia, US ground-based intermediate-range missiles would have to be deployed in other countries, and this likely would spark opposition from their populations, a factor that 3 decades ago contributed to the negotiation of the INF Treaty itself and the elimination of those missiles in Europe. The missiles the treaty prohibits increase the risk of miscalculation or misadventure in a crisis. Missiles of this kind may be forward deployed and intermingled with other forces. If deployed within range of strategically significant sites, such as strategic forces and command centers of an adversary, shorter warning times give an adversary less time to evaluate a possible attack, increasing incentives to keep forces on high alert. Advances in stealth and accuracy make even conventionally armed missiles a more significant factor. New intermediate-range missiles would join a mix of stealthy delivery platforms, increasingly capable missile defenses, and modes of cyber and electronic attack that disrupt sensing and communication systems. All of this adds to the dangers of confrontations between advanced militaries whose speed and complexity already challenge human comprehension. And it's important to note that arms control agreements and the institutions and verification mechanisms that sustain and are sustained by them can reduce the risk of war in ways that go beyond the limitations of particular dangerous armaments. The process of negotiating possible arms control agreements, even when prospects for tangible progress seem grim, has independent value in a period of growing tensions among nuclear-armed states. They allow the military and political leadership of the adversaries to better understand each other's intentions and their fears, and they build broader channels of communications between military and government bureaucracies that can be of tremendous value when tensions rise. So the best course would be to use the dispute over the INF Treaty as a moment to renew rather than discard the negotiating frameworks and institutions that played a significant role in avoiding catastrophe during the Cold War. But as noted earlier, it's pretty clear that the US plans to go forward with the withdrawal process. Now, there's a legitimate question as to whether it is constitutional for a US president to withdraw from a Senate-ratified treaty over congressional opposition. However, such core foreign policy controversies seldom are finally resolved here in the United States by the courts. There are ways, however, that the US Congress could act that might preserve enough of the status quo to leave space for further diplomacy. It has the practical power to prevent the administration from taking action contrary to the INF Treaty. Most important, it can refuse to fund weapons testing, production, or deployment that would violate the treaty. And Senator Jeff Merkley and 6 colleagues have introduced the Prevention of Arms Race Act of 2018. That act characterizes withdrawal from the INF Treaty without consultation with Congress as, quotes, a serious breach of Congress's proper constitutional role as a co-equal branch of government, close quotes, and erects barriers to spending on missiles that would violate the treaty. So now I'd like to turn a bit to our disarmament work going forward in light of some lessons that we might draw from the movements in the period leading up to the INF Treaty. We appear to be facing a period of renewed arms racing and one in which prospects for arms control are indeed dim. And first, I think we have to have more effective inside-outside strategies this time around. Those who work for arms control and centers of power must remember that large mobilized movements calling for fundamental change are needed to really move the boundaries of the politically possible. And those working for deeper, broader change have to recognize that it will take a long time and that more limited measures that stave off disaster are essential. So we have to be discerning about when to focus our energies on interim measures in a time when we need our main efforts to be aimed at building the social power to make real change. And looking at the bigger picture, the Cold War now is 3 decades in the past. We are no longer even really in the post-Cold War period, a moment that ended sometime between the beginning of the second Iraq invasion and the outbreak of fighting in Ukraine in 2014. The particular moment of opportunity for ridding ourselves of nuclear weapons that was created by ending the Cold War confrontation now, unfortunately, is gone. Some have compared this moment to the run-up to World War I, with new economic and military powers rising to challenge old ones, and with potential flashpoints on the margins of declining great powers and their spheres of influence. But we're really in many ways facing a new moment, and we obscure its nature and are still inadequate understanding of it if we leap to any easy analogies. And because we are once again in a period where the first priority must be preventing wars among nuclear-armed countries, we need an approach that goes beyond single-issue disarmament advocacy. We need to focus more broadly on the forces driving high-tech militarism and war. And we're also in a time of rising political mobilization after 2 or more decades largely without broad multi-issue movements in the nuclear-armed states. And the potential for such movements is there. And we will find, I think, that the best way to make the issues of war, peace, and disarmament a significant strand in emerging movements is to explore the common causes of the dangers and injustices we are struggling against. And the most influential campaigns against nuclear weapons in the past arose in times and places where there were movements of this kind. And a significant characteristic of those movements was reflection and discussion about the nature of the society that produced these terrible weapons and that systematically generates the risk of wars in which they might be used. And this included the movements of the 1980s against the US missiles in Europe, the missiles ultimately eliminated by the INF Treaty. It was no accident that the Euro missile crisis sparked perhaps the most intense moment of resistance to nuclear weapons. The inhabitants of countries hosting US nuclear missiles faced the possibility that a nuclear war could be fought on their soil without even their own government's consent. And this raised a question seldom asked by inhabitants of nuclear-armed countries. Whose nuclear weapons are they really? Whose interests do they protect? And this question leads naturally to others. As E.P. Thompson, one of the founders of the European disarmament movement, asked in 1981, is nuclear war preferable to being overcome by the enemy? Are the deaths of 15 or 20 million and the utter destruction of the country preferable to an occupation which might offer the possibility, after some years, of resurgence and recuperation? And finally, are we ourselves prepared to endorse the use of such weapons against the innocent, the children, and the aged of an enemy? The people of every nuclear-armed country should be asking these questions again today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andy. And we will have an opportunity for questions a little bit later. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Pavel Podvig. We're extremely fortunate to have a Russian presenter for this topic. Pavel is an independent analyst based in Geneva, where he runs his research project, Russian Nuclear Forces. He is also a senior research fellow at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research and a researcher with the Program on Science and Global Security at Princeton University. His current research focuses on Russian strategic forces and the nuclear weapons complex, as well as technical and political aspects of nuclear nonproliferation, disarmament, missile defense, and US-Russian arms control process. Pavel is a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials. He has a physics degree from MIT and a PhD in political science from the Moscow Institute of World Economy and International Relations. And you can read his longer bio in the chat box. Also, we'll post it there. Welcome, Pavel.
Okay, thank you very much, Jackie. And it's it's a tough act to follow. I cannot possibly be as eloquent as Enzi, so I'll try to stick to the more of a kind of a practical issues that are related to this whole debate. And one thing I want to start with is that now that the treaty is actually almost is coming to the end, you've heard just earlier that the United States and Russia had an unsuccessful meeting in Geneva that tried to resolve some of the issues, and apparently the United States indicated that they will submit the notice of withdrawal on February 2nd, although it's not entirely clear, but that's where we're going. And 6 months after that, the treaty will cease to exist. So we are on the kind of a finishing line. I don't think that there much more can be done to save the treaty. But the problem is that we still don't really know what this is all about. And so what is this violation that the United States is accusing Russia of? And because since we don't know what the violation is, it's difficult to judge whether it's really whether it could be justified at all. The dismantlement of one of the few arms control and disarmament agreements, and so I'll try to walk through that. And so the first question is that do we know if Russia actually violated the treaty? The answer to that is probably yes, in the sense that there is it's very likely that there was a technical violation of the treaty, and the treaty there are some provisions that are kind of very detailed, and it is entirely possible that yes, Russia did developed and tested a missile that has the capability to fly to the ranges that are prohibited by the INF treaty. But again, as I said, Russia, of course, denies that, and we don't know this for certain because we haven't seen actual evidence that the United States claims it has. But I would not discount that possibility, and I think in all likelihood it is possible. However, the next question is whether this violation was in any way serious enough to, from military or political standpoint, to warrant the kind of reaction that we see, which is again the dismantlement of one of the few arms control agreements. And I think the answer to that is probably not, in the sense that from the military point of view, this missile, even if we assume that it was indeed deployed in violation, militarily doesn't really add anything to either to Russia's capabilities or it doesn't really change the level of threat that Russian nuclear forces could pose to Europe. And partly that is because there are plenty of other nuclear weapons around, and in Russia in particular, Russia, for example, has the capability to deploy sea-launched cruise missiles these are not limited by any treaty. The air-launched cruise missiles are somewhat limited by the New START, but not really limited. So in that sense, and it is, I think, a very important point to make, we should not we should not think that if if this issue is resolved, if all of a sudden Russia decides to come back to compliance and eliminate the missile in question, that if that happens, then all the kind of problems in Europe would be resolved. No, not at all, because as I said, I mean, there are plenty of other nuclear weapons around. There are plenty of other nuclear missiles around, deployed around Europe, and these are arguably the very presence of nuclear weapons is the threat to the security of Europe. So that's that I think is one of the points that I really want to kind of underline. So what are potential negative consequences of what we are looking at? And of course, it's not very often happens that a certain political move has all negative consequences and doesn't really have any upside to it. But this, for either country, it is really genuinely, I am genuinely puzzled that the United States actually decided to go ahead and withdraw from the treaty, because there is no positive. There is no positive outcome that the United States could achieve, because one immediate result would be that Russia would be free to deploy whatever missiles cruise missile it wants to deploy, including the missile that kind of raises all these issues with the United States. More than that, Russia could probably deploy other systems like ballistic missiles of the intermediate range, which are currently not deployed, but Russia has a system that can be deployed in that capacity. I just don't see how that would security of anyone in Europe or the United States would benefit from that. And on the other side, if we're talking about the United States, then we could probably see deployment of return of nuclear sea launch cruise missiles. I don't think that we will see a return of deployment of nuclear systems in Europe, because the opposition to that would be very strong. And the other potentially very negative consequence would be the demise of the New START treaty. This is the treaty that limits strategic forces, and it's very difficult to see how, in the atmosphere that is created by the with kind of a dismantlement of the INF treaty, how the New START could survive. So it's very likely that it will not be extended when it comes to that point in 2021. So, and the final point, which, and I really I'm grateful to Andy for kind of speaking about it so eloquently, and I would concur with him here, is that it is wrong to assume that somehow the United States and the Europeans and Russia would sort of come to their senses and kind of sit and make this kind of a calculated decision and weigh all the consequences, that security interest and everything, and come to the conclusion that, oh, they really need to limit these missiles or return to compliance or return to arms control. That wasn't how it worked the last time around when the original INF treaty was concluded. In my view, the most important factor that actually made that the INF treaty possible, arguably made the START treaty and the nuclear reductions in general possible, was the pressure that was the governments in the United States and Europe, to some extent in the Soviet Union, although certainly not that much, that the government felt that there is these weapons, the systems are dangerous, and the arms race is getting out of control. So unfortunately, I think unless we get to the point where it will become so dangerous that people will actually start raising their voice in a serious way, it's very difficult to expect that the United States and Russia and others would return to serious arms control discussions. There is hope, of course, and the hope is that it's in the 30 plus years since the last round of these tensions, we have a better understanding of the dangers of these weapons, and we have some kind of a experience of tackling them and dealing with them. So maybe the hope is that it will not come to the point where it will become really dangerous and it will threaten really serious consequences. So, and I think that the work that the Abolition 2000 Coalition does is actually very important, precisely because sort of you are part of the system that tries to exert that pressure on the governments and communicate these dangers to the public. Let me stop here, and I'd be happy to answer the questions.
Thank you very much, Pavel. It's very important to hear have your voice on this call. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Dave Webb. Dave has been the chair of the UK's Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, since 2010. He is also currently chair of the Yorkshire Region CND, convener of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, a patron of Scientists for Global Responsibility in the UK, a vice president of the International Peace Bureau, and a member of the Abolition 2000 Coordinating Committee. Dave is an emeritus professor of Leeds Beckett University, having retired from there in 2012. He had been a professor of engineering, but later went on to help found, develop, and teach peace and conflict studies. Dave.
Yeah, thank you very much. Coming in at this stage, of course, most of the things have been said, or a lot of stuff has been said already. So I'd just like to kind of bring a bit of a European context to this, and much of what I was going to say has been said, but I'll go through some important aspects, I think, as far as we see it in our campaign here in Europe. The withdrawal, the proposed withdrawal of the US from the INF has been supported really by NATO foreign ministers here in Europe and elsewhere. And they've joined in and declared that Russia has developed a system that violates the INF, as has already been described. And they say it's now up to Russia to preserve the INF treaty. But of course, they don't mention the establishment of the US and NATO missile defense bases in Eastern Europe, which has been a problem seen by Russia for many years now, and the interceptor missiles in Romania that also have already been mentioned. And along with that, there are these very powerful radar systems in Turkey, in the UK and in Norway that are operating as part of that kind of system. So the withdrawal and destruction of this treaty is seen as being extremely serious by us in Europe, and threatens a new dangerous arms race that brings us even closer to the possibility that nuclear weapons will actually be used, and the disastrous consequences that that would have on all life on the planet. We also see that President Trump's program to build and deploy a new generation of nuclear weapons, supposedly of low yield and therefore more usable in the near future, and billions of dollars are being spent on this program. And even though they're called low yield, even though they could be as powerful, if not more powerful, than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And these had been seen by Europeans anyway, as being a possibility for being stationed in Europe. I know Pavel says that he doesn't think that's likely, but it's certainly of a great concern to us in Europe. Because where would these short-range, more usable nuclear weapons be based? But somewhere close to their possible targets, like Russia or China, i.e. in Europe. And so we are soon to be faced possibly with the threat of a return to the situation where the US plans to station short and intermediate range nuclear weapons in Europe so as to limit any future nuclear war there, thus leaving the US mainland relatively untouched. Now, whether this is part of the US strategy or not, of course, I don't know, but this is the way it can be seen, it is being seen by many observers in Europe. So we in the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, we're calling on both Russia and the US to fully comply with the terms of the INF, and threatening to withdraw from that treaty rather than proposing negotiations to resolve the outstanding issues is extremely dangerous. It's a vital treaty which has ensured the destruction of nearly 2,700 short and medium range missiles and has played a crucial role in ensuring that US missiles are not situated in Europe. I'm just trying to skip over some of these things. We also see the treaty as a kind of a trend in the way that President Trump has been working, to be part of a wider pattern of US disengaging from essential international nuclear agreements and treaties. President Trump has pulled the US from the Paris Agreement on climate change, and last year the US withdrew from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which aims to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons in return for the lifting of sanctions imposed by the UN, US and EU, European Union. The US has now imposed new sanctions, although the others involved have stayed committed more or less to the deal. And that's not all, of course. The US withdrawal from the INF treaty also calls to question, as was mentioned earlier, whether Washington will work with Moscow to renew the New START treaty in 2021, which is due to expire. The new New START treaty signed in 2010 limits the number of nuclear warheads of both Russia and the US. And this treaty is therefore fundamental for preventing a global arms race and ensuring nuclear de-escalation. If we add to the commitment, if we add all of this to the commitment of all the nuclear weapon states to upgrade their nuclear weapons arsenals, even though this is in contravention of the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which requires those that have signed it, the P5 nuclear states, to engage in nuclear disarmament. We find a situation that's reminiscent of the situation at the height of the Cold War in the 1980s, and that's already been mentioned. In 1979, there was the decision to deploy US cruise and Pershing missiles in Britain and several other Western countries. At the same time, the Soviet Union was deploying its new SS-20 missiles in Eastern Europe. And 108 Pershing IIs in Western Germany and 464 cruise missiles across Western Europe were due to be deployed. 160 to the UK, 112 to Italy, this is cruise missiles, 96 to Western Germany, and 48 to Belgium and the Netherlands each. And 96 of those cruise missiles were scheduled to appear in Greenham Common, or to be stationed in Greenham Common in December 1983. And another base, Molesworth, was to house 64 cruise missiles by the end of 96. Now, many of you will obviously have heard of Greenham Common and perhaps also of Molesworth. These cruise missiles were mounted on road vehicles and left their base on regular exercises. Cruise Watch was established, which was a network of protesters. This was formed to track and harass the cruise convoys wherever they went. Because of the scale of the determination of the protests, the convoys soon had to have large police escorts and only left the camp under cover of darkness. Now, at this time, I'd emphasize that there was a great kind of feeling of unease throughout Europe about the situation, the political situation, and the possibility of a nuclear war. It was engaging a lot of people in the protests. Thousands of people took part in protests in Britain and around Europe over these particular missiles. I don't see that we're in that kind of position at the moment where we can mobilize huge numbers of people on the same scale. So, for example, in December 1982, 35,000 women joined hands around Greenham Common Base. And in March of that year, of the following year, 1983, after there was a speech by Ronald Reagan where he called the Soviet Union the evil empire, and following on from that, 70,000 protesters formed a 14-mile chain from Aldermaston, which is the place where the bombs are created in Britain, to Greenham Common. So this is a large number of people participating in the protests. That went on to an even bigger protest in terms of women's protest at Greenham Common. This has become legendary, I guess. Not only were people protesting about the nuclear weapons there, but also questioning the society that could create and sustain such weapons. And all kinds of questions were being asked, all kinds of answers were offered about how we might move forward and about the kind of society we want to create. 50,000 women surrounded Greenham Common in December 1983. And the day started as a silent vigil where women held up mirrors to allow the base to symbolically look back at itself and its actions. However, the day ended with hundreds of arrests as the women pulled down large sections of the fence. In 1984, a rainbow village was established and occupied the unfenced, so far unfenced airfield at Molesworth, which was due to receive cruise missiles as well. And in February of the following year, in 1985, the British government had had enough of the protests, and 1,500 troops and police were deployed to remove the peace camp at Molesworth, this peaceful group of people who had been camping there for some time in protest at the establishment of the nuclear weapons there, the cruise missiles there. It was kind of highlighted by the fact that the Minister of Defence at that time, Michael Heseltine, was seen to be wearing a flak jacket, like he was in full battle kind of gear, along with the troops, and gleefully kind of invaded the peaceful camp there. The cost of the operation to clear the fence around RAF Molesworth was of the order of £6.5 million. So this was causing an awful lot of problems for the government. It was observed by President Gorbachev as being something that people throughout Europe were not happy with nuclear weapons. They wanted to get rid of them. And of course, this led to he and Ronald Reagan getting together in Reykjavik and putting together the INF Treaty. And eventually in 1992, Greenham Common was returned to the UK and is now no longer, there are not many traces left of the cruise missile base. So we believe that Britain actually has an important role to play in this particular crisis. It should be encouraging a diplomatic solution to the crisis rather than fanning the flames that can lead to nuclear war, standing by and allowing crucial nuclear arms control agreements to be torn up, places the whole world in great danger. How many times are we going to actually get away with the threats that the existence of these weapons of mass destruction, of mass murder even poses? We have managed to scrape through so far, but for how long can we continue along this path? In 2017, as been mentioned already by Jackie, the United Nations adopted a historic international treaty banning nuclear weapons, which was supported by 122 countries. The new treaty will make it illegal when it becomes into force under international law to develop, test, produce, manufacture, acquire, possess, stockpile, transfer, use, or threaten to use nuclear weapons. It also makes it illegal to assist or encourage anyone to engage in these activities. The nuclear weapon states have refused, of course, to participate in this process so far, instead releasing a statement attacking the treaty. But many of their citizens are very much in favor of such a treaty and want their governments to sign. While nuclear weapons exist, we are never safe from a military disagreement escalating into nuclear war. The international community must now really lend its weight to the argument that the INF must be saved. We need an outcry on this, such as we've not really seen for many years. For it could be Europe that will host these missiles once again and bear the military brunt, but the problems will undoubtedly extend far beyond the continent. The UK has a crucial role to play in this. As I mentioned, whatever special relationship exists with the US must now be utilized to save the treaty and prevent a disastrous descent into a new nuclear arms race based in Europe. In actively reducing nuclear stockpiles, the treaty has been an important step towards nuclear disarmament. While the geopolitical and technological situation is much different today than from the Cold War era during which it was written, it remains essential to maintaining global security. And certainly the feeling that's developing amongst citizens in Europe is one of urgency, that something is done about nuclear weapons. Urgent action is needed now. Together, we have to work together to make sure that our calls for a safer world are heard. I think that's part of that was a statement that CND issued on the try to safeguard the INF Treaty. And I think it does require for us to work together throughout Europe, throughout the world really, to show that we've had enough of these weapons. Previously, the INF Treaty came apart because mainly of the force of the will of the people, and we have to produce that force once more. We have to be there. We have to show our governments the way forward. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. And our last speaker will be Regina Hagen. Regina has been active in the peace movement for more than 35 years. She has specialized in nuclear weapons, missile defenses, and space weaponization, both as an academic and an activist in Germany and internationally. Regina is a member of the Abolition 2000 Coordinating Committee, a board member of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, and a spokesperson for the German campaign Nuclear Weapons Free Now. She holds a master's degree in technical translation, has worked in industry and at Darmstadt University of Technology for many years, and is now managing editor of the German magazine Science and Peace. Regina.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this webinar, which is a premiere for me. I've never watched one or not to talk participated in one. I prepared a few slides which I want to share with you, and I hope that it works technically. I must first share the screen. And I hope that you can now see it. That's not the one I wanted to share. Let's try this one. Tony, can you give me some feedback whether you can see this? Your microphone.
Yes, we can see the slide now.
Okay, good. I thought this might help me to go through this. The previous speakers already in some detail spoke about the dual track decision, that the decision NATO took back in 1979, which at that time was to deploy Pershing II and cruise missiles in Western Europe as a response to the Soviet deployment of the SS-20 missiles, while at the same time offering negotiations on such missiles with the Soviet Union. So from the perspective of today, I think the situation is even worse than at that time, because the US no longer offers such negotiations on the problems they see with the purported treaty violation of Russia. In 1983 to 87, and Dave has already mentioned that the United States deployed 108 Pershing II and 304 cruise missiles in total. The plan was to have more, but then they started negotiating the treaty. And those missiles, the ballistic missiles, the Pershing II and the cruise missiles, they were deployed in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in Belgium, that's often ignored, and in Italy. At the same time, the Soviet Union had SS-20 deployed in their part of the world, in Russia, but also in Belarus and in Ukraine. So as you can see on that map, Europe is not that large. The distance between the end of the arrows from Germany and the Soviet Union pointing to Russia, they roughly point at Berlin and at Moscow, and that's just 1,700 kilometers. Whereas the range of intermediate range missiles can be up to 5,500, starting with 500. So if we, or if the United States initiates a new arms race in that range of missiles, Europe again would be under threat, all of Europe. And maybe we should remind that the pre-warning time for mid-range missiles might be as brief as 5 minutes. So we would be in the middle of this all, and we were in the middle of all this in the 1980s, and Dave already reported how in the United Kingdom, but also in other European countries, there were huge protests in the 1980s against this build-up of intermediate range missiles from the US side. It was not so easy to protest in the Soviet Union at that time, and we don't know so much about it. But in Western Germany at that time, there were huge protests, but also in Eastern Germany, actually. There were hundreds of thousands of people on the road and in squares on this particular day in October. And famous people joined the blockades, like Robert Jung, and Gollwitzer and other very, very famous people. For months on end, people would sit in front of the deployment site in Mutlangen here in Germany. At the protests, as the previous speakers already pointed out, led to President Hagen and the General Secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, to negotiate the INF Treaty, which entered into force in 1998. Some of the speakers have already pointed out that Article 13 of the INF Treaty foresees a special verification commission to resolve questions relating to the compliance, and missing here, the compliance of the treaty, and to agree on measures that might be needed to make this treaty effective. At the time, the treaty also has an Article 11, which says that for the purpose of ensuring verification of compliance with the provisions of the treaty, each party shall have the right to conduct on-site inspections. And that actually did happen in many instances on invitation. Mostly, both sides actually observed the missiles being destroyed. The negative part of this Article 11 is its fifth paragraph, which says that each party has the right to conduct such inspections for 13 years. If not, both parties, excuse me, could call for such inspections today, but I think if the goodwill existed, they could still do so, and they could, going back, they could ask for such inspections, on-site inspections, through this special verification commission. And I understand that the Russian Foreign Ministry confirmed yesterday that they actually invited the United States to come and do such an inspection. So for me, it is not acceptable at all that they keep blaming each other, but don't use the provisions the INF Treaty foresees. Some of the speakers, Andy and especially Andy, have also spoken about the anti-ballistic missile treaty that limited ABM complexes in both the United States and the Soviet Union to one complex with no more than 100 ballistic missiles. And in 2001, US President George W. Bush announced the US withdrawal, which took effect in the summer of 2002. Which means that there are no restrictions, I think Pavel pointed out, or maybe it was Andy, that there would be no restrictions to short and intermediate range missiles if the INF Treaty was cancelled. The same already is true for ballistic missile defenses, and I particularly want to mention this because NATO, together with the United States, is working on missile defense deployment in Europe. And I took this picture actually from the NATO website, pointing out various elements of that system to be deployed here in Europe. And some of the deployment sites in Europe are Poland, and starting from 2020 with Interceptors, Germany with the Ramstein base for the command and control, Aegis destroyers, 4 Aegis ships based in Rota, Spain, and cruising the Mediterranean, and an interceptor site already active in Romania, and a forward-based radar, X-band radar, I understand, in Turkey. Now, today, I'll switch the picture. Today, the Pentagon did a briefing just 1.5 hours ago on their missile defense review, and they do announce that they want to expand their missile defense drastically. And this is actually the website of the Defense Department. So this is the press information they issued, the US Department issued on this issue, and they say that they want to pursue advanced technologies and innovative concepts. They want to expand the number of their space-based sensors, and they want to develop technology that does not yet exist for the boost phase, that is the launching phase of missiles, and want to use directed energy weapons. And that sounds a bit like Star Wars. Sorry, I mean, this is terrible. And they want to also increase the number of their interceptors in the United States by more than 50%. So I think this is very serious, because the more missile defense there is, the higher the likelihood that a country attempts a first strike and hopes to eliminate the missiles that survived the first strike of their adversary. So I think the situation is very, very dangerous and completely unacceptable. And to end, I want to introduce you to an urgent action we launched in Germany today. And the logo you see on the right-hand side of my screen, the Büchel ist überall atomwaffenfrei jetzt, that's the logo of the German campaign of the German Abolition 2000 section to get rid of the US nuclear weapons that are still deployed here, which are not missile weapons, but they would be deployed by airplanes. So we initiated an urgent action and hope to make it international starting today. And the action is based on the graphic you see. We prepared it in 7 languages. The no or niet or no or nie or nein. With the sentence, disarmament creates security, save the INF treaty. And maybe I should mention that colleagues from Germany are traveled to Berlin today, and they will have 2 meetings in Berlin tomorrow. One is with the German Foreign Ministry, and the other is in the Russian embassy to talk about the preservation of the INF treaty. We demanded, and that's what they want to talk about. And they also asked for a meeting at the US embassy and never even got a reply. So what we are doing, those of you who can see the slides I'm using, can see the tiny URL link. When you go there, you can see the graphic in 7 languages. And we ask people, I will post the tiny URL in the chat section when I'm done here. And we ask people to send either Twitter messages to US Botschaft and US Russbotschaft, that's the US and Russian embassies here in Berlin. The background is that we also already did a postcard campaign to these 2 embassies, so we thought it might be a good idea to continue with them and to use the hashtags Save the INF, INF Treaty and Nuclear Ban, or to send emails to the US Embassy and the Russian Embassy, Russische Botschaft here in Germany. And at the tiny URL, you can find all these addresses again. So we have this graphic in several languages, which I will just briefly show you. In German, Abrüstung schafft Sicherheit, INF-Vertrag erhalten. And in Russian, and I'll not try to say it, I can read it, but I won't try to say it. Maybe Pavel can do it to us afterwards. In French, in Polish, in Italian, in Spanish, and that was it, yeah. So we ask you, we urge you to how can I get back to my screen? Stoppen, here, stoppen. Yeah, it works. We urge you to participate in this urgent action, and I'll try to share the link with you now in the chat. I'll try to do that.
Malta has posted the link.
Okay,
Regina.
thank you. Okay, good. So that was basically it. And I think it is important that we become active and don't get too depressed about the political situation, as bad as it is. But we shouldn't despair. We should use the energy we have and also encourage other people to join. And this urgent action is something that is easy to do. We hope that it will have success. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Regina, and thanks to each of our presenters. I think these were really terrific presentations, very informative, very sobering, but also reminding us of the success that we have had in the past and the necessity of mobilizing, not losing hope, and moving forward. So we now want to open the floor for questions or action suggestions if you have any. We'd like to ask people to keep their remarks to 90 seconds. At the bottom of your screen, if you click on participants, you can see a little icon to raise your hand. And so if you wish to speak, please do that. And I will ask Tony to call on people and unmute them in turn. Yeah, we'll take 3 questions at a time and then ask our panelists to respond. If you want to address your question to a specific speaker, please make that clear. So are we ready then for our first speaker?
Yes, Jackie, I'm going to call on Alan, John Burrows, and Bruce Wright.
Okay.
Yeah, Tony, can I suggest that John Burrows goes first? He had his hand up first, and I'm quite happy for him to go first, and I'll go after John.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Right. John, you're on.
So this, as Jackie said, this has really been a fabulous webinar. I want to say something encouraging. The INF treaty is on its way out. Things will have to change rather dramatically for the INF treaty to be saved. But it is also true that arms control does not consist only of agreements. It consists of decisions about developing and deploying weapons. In other words, it can be stopped at the phase of funding in the countries that have or could have the weapons. And there is potential, I'm directing this especially at US citizens, there is potential here in the US to stop funding of systems that would violate the treaty, even after the treaty is no longer in effect. As I understand it right now, there's a system in development which would be a conventional intermediate range missile. Aside from that, I'm not sure there's anything else in development. In any case, the House Armed Services Committee is now chaired by Adam Smith. He has expressed great skepticism about a range of weapon systems, nuclear weapon systems. And so I think there's really a basis for Americans to say to Congress, don't fund, don't build, don't test, don't deploy missiles that would violate the INF treaty, whether or not the INF treaty is in existence. And that could help lay the foundation for future arms control and, dare I say, disarmament. And, you know, Pavel can comment on this, and I invite him to do so. But I would hope that if the U.S. actually was restrained in testing and deploying such systems, that Russia would also be similarly restrained.
Thanks, John. Tony, next speaker.
Alan, you're on.
Thank you. And John gave a perfect introduction to what I was going to speak about, because this is what our network, I'm the Global Coordinator of Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and this is an approach that we are really looking at taking, you know, understanding that it looks as though the INF treaty is definitely out, but that there are ways of being able to campaign against weapon systems. And that can be done through civil society working with their legislators. John mentioned the US and the fact that Adam Smith is going to be it's just now, come in as the chair of the Armed Services Committee in the House. And in the Senate, there is the Senate resolution S3667, which is, Andy mentioned the resolution. It's not only about trying to preserve the INF treaty, but it also has in it a section saying if the treaty dissolves, then they would still work to prevent the development of any weapon systems which that treaty is trying to stop. So United for Peace and Justice has done an action alert to get support for S3667, and we can give you the web link to that quite easily. I'll just add it under share, I think, or chat. I'll put it under
chat.
Alan. Sorry, yeah, chat, isn't it? Sorry, I'm just looking at chat. It's like, oh yeah, I scroll down the bottom. Oh no, chat. Where is chat? Here
I'll do it after. Yeah, okay.
There we are. That's the United for Peace and Justice one. So that's within the United. Oh, sorry, you asked me to start my video. I apologise. So that's that one. Then we just had a meeting 2 days ago in Basel, Switzerland, where we brought representatives of Mayors for Peace Europe and PND parliamentarians and partner organisations together, and we adopted an appeal, which is not just about the INF treaty, but it takes a similar sort of approach to that. And that appeal, I'm just going to give you the link to now. Here we go. That also has the same sort of approach, but not just directed against the United States, also directed against Russia. So we're gathering signatures, endorsers for it at the moment over the next few days, and then we'll send it to the leaders of Russia and the United States, and also to the congressional leaders of the United States and the leaders in the Duma and the State Council in Russia. And in addition, the third aspect of this is to strengthen up the resolve of the European countries to say no to having any missiles deployed in Europe, regardless of whether or not the INF treaty is preserved or not. I think this is some actions that we can take based on pretty much what John has been saying. You know, that what the main thing is to prevent these weapon systems being developed. And there are ways of doing that even if the INF treaty goes. Thanks.
Alan, there's a comment that says that the links are not coming through in the chat window. If you could try again.
I think the reason is that it came to me personally. You need to address it to everyone. You can resend those.
Okay, so the next person on my list is Bruce Wright. Go ahead, Bruce, you're on.
Yes, Bruce Wright. I'm with the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign and Refuge Ministries International, as well as the Revolutionary Road radio show. I'm wondering, to what extent do our guests think that NATO will ally themselves or accelerate the potential arms race that is already beginning, and to what extent can we deal with that, particularly as we're coming, I know many of us are going to be involved in events the end of March, beginning of April, around the NATO summit, which we understand has been moved to the fall, but there'll still be celebrations, I guess, in DC of the 70th anniversary. Many of us are involved in organizing efforts there, including myself. But I'm wondering, to what extent do you think NATO is going to play a pivotal role in this? And then the other question I have, or comment, is I've already sent emails to some of the guests, but I do have a radio show that people are welcome to avail themselves to. It is on 5 broadcast stations, AM and FM, as well as the web and YouTube and podcasted and TuneIn app, all the social media formats. I feel like this needs to be discussed more, particularly this brewing new arms race. And lastly, is there a way to make a more user-friendly version available of that press release? Because I'd like to share that and be able to cut and paste it. I don't know where specifically on DOD do you go to get that info. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I think we have a few questions, and Regina, maybe is there a way you could post a link to that press release.
Let me unmute Regina.
Yes, and the I will sorry, I will copy the link to the chat section, and also now the missile defense review brochure is out, 108 pages, and I will also send the link through the chat sections there to everyone interested. Is it appropriate to answer Bruce's question about
Yes.
NATO from my perspective?
Please do.
I actually think that's a crucial point. I was, well, I've been involved in this issue for a long time, but I must say I was shocked how outspoken the General Secretary of NATO was just at the end of December in an interview with the German press agency dpa, where he very clearly said Russia is violating the treaty, not Russia is accused of violating it, or there is some indication they are violating it. But he says Russia is violating the treaty. They deployed systems that violate the treaty, and this is not acceptable. The red line has been crossed. And media picked up on that quite extensively. And to me, it is unacceptable that the General Secretary of NATO simply echoes US President Trump in making these accusations, rather than trying to, what's a good word, to diffuse the situation. And another aspect we have been observing in the past many years is the role of the media in echoing such warmongering. That the media simply echo some of the state leaders with their accusations. They no longer report, but they fire they fuel the fire, and that is a very, very dangerous situation. And unfortunately, I don't know what to do about that. But I think that that increases the danger. As well, with actually withdrawing from the INF treaty, but then also with deploying missiles. And I'm not sure that Pavel Podvig is right and that they would not be deployed in Europe. Poland, for example, has frequently offered to host US nuclear weapons. I don't know whether they would be serious once that was offered, but it's been in the room.
Thank you, Regina. I wonder if any of the other panelists would like to respond to the question about the role of NATO. I also want to point out another weird dimension of what's going on, which is Trump's frequently critical comments about NATO and threats to withdraw the US from NATO. So Pavel or Andy or Dave?
I have something to say about this.
Please.
And exactly what you were talking about is part of it. I mean, I think that the situation is really complex between the governments right now. We think back on the sequence of events. You had the announcement of the withdrawal in late October by Trump and Putin. And then, shortly after that, you had these talks. Pompeo was in Europe and had talks with the leaders of NATO states, and they were clearly unhappy with this decision, and that they at least put on enough pressure to get this vague 2-month window before the U.S. then, and now ending February 2nd, before the U.S. would go forward with the withdrawal. So, and again, Trump's apparently repeated statements within the US government that he wants to withdraw from NATO, to which there is extensive resistance within the US government. And apparently, and also Trump's behavior at the various NATO-related events. You know, you may have a situation where the European states are just trying to figure out what they can do to keep the U.S. and NATO and to keep Trump, you know, somewhat under control on this stuff. So yes, we'll back the U.S. on, you know, very firmly on the claim of the violation. I don't think that necessarily means they're comfortable either with the withdrawal or with how the diplomacy has occurred or not occurred around the violation. And that's something that I think it will be really helpful, for example, because, you know, press coverage in the U.S. on these matters is, first of all, really sparse, and second of all, not very good. If our European colleagues can keep the rest of us in the loop about what they're seeing about this, it will be really helpful.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Pavel, do you want to say anything?
Yes. Let me try. Say a couple of words. Basically, first to the point that John, the question John asked, whether Russia would restrain itself in reciprocating restraining the United States does. I wouldn't hold my breath and sort of, but I think it's the way I see it. It's not like Russia is waiting for the treaty to collapse and sort of roll out all these systems. I think we could hope that there will be, at least initially, there will be some restraint. Although, I mean, slowly it could ramp up. So it's, but on the other hand, it would be important, yes, if there is an understanding that even if the treaty is not enforced, still the system should be restrained, then that would be an important factor. To the role of NATO and the possibility of deployment of new weapons, Regina correctly mentioned that there is ideas floating around that a state like Poland could invite the United States to deploy its weapons. But my take is that NATO is, with all its faults, it's a fairly cautious institution, and I think a move by one of the members to invite new weapons on its territory would meet some resistance from other members of NATO. We've seen that story to some extent with the missile defense deployment back during the Bush administration, and it was a difficult dynamic there. So I'm cautiously optimistic about the NATO role in that. Again, there are people shown actually during this discussion of the INF debate that they are concerned about the escalation about the arms race, and so I hope that they will play kind of a moderating role in that discussion. And finally, the point that I think Regina made a very good point about the role of the press and the sort of the expert community, in fact, and I think this is something I've been discussing with my colleagues, and I agree that the press, the media, and the expert community actually failed to ask the correct questions about what is the violation, why this is the United States is accusing Russia, and in the end, the people just uncritically accepted the narrative that was coming out of the administration. I'll put a link to a column that I published in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, that sort of where I'm trying to kind of look into that issue, sort of how it happened that this narrative about a blatant violation on the Russian side, how it became so dominant. Okay, let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavel.
Jack-
Dave, did you want to add anything?
Sorry, Jackie. I have one more person who'd like to make a comment, and I think maybe we should get that comment, go to Dave, and then start to wrap up.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
So
Go ahead then.
So we've got Alan Haber who's pending. Alan, go ahead.
Thank you. I have two questions, appreciating this whole discussion. I heard a report that Mr. Putin said the Russians have a whole new missile technology that can avoid all the U.S. defense systems. So the whole past technology of missile defense is really obsolete, and the whole system has to change. So is there any truth to that? Is that a lot of bluster, or is there something new in the picture? The second question is, I've been concerned with how at the local city council level these questions can be raised. And the Conference of Mayors and the Mayors for Peace put out resolutions on the nuclear weapons ban treaty. Is there similar material for local city governments to address on this question? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. I think we will go to the panelists for a wrap up, but let me just answer that question because I'm the U.S. Coordinator of Mayors for Peace and am intimately involved with those resolutions. Actually, the 2018 Mayors for Peace resolution unanimously adopted by the U.S. Conference of Mayors includes a call for preservation of the INF treaty. And so that could be taken directly to local city councils and either abstracted from or have the councils and mayors endorse the U.S. Conference of Mayors statement. So let's go back to the panels. And Dave, we didn't give you a chance to respond to the last question. And then I think we should go back to Pavel, and if anybody has any last words, we'll wrap it up.
Okay, thank you. I think with regard to NATO, it's a really important issue that we don't really tend to get NATO discussed too much in Britain anyway. It's not really big, high on the agenda. It doesn't appear in press very often. So people are not really questioning it enough and understanding what it's saying, what it's doing. I think I think I read out we had a letter back from our Foreign Office which quoted the NATO allies as saying that they support the US efforts to bring Russia back to full and verifiable compliance and so on. So they're definitely with one voice supporting the American stance. And in this country, even in Scotland, which has got a huge majority of people who want nuclear weapons out of their country, which is where the UK so-called nuclear deterrence, nuclear weapon system Trident, is all in Scotland, in submarine in Scotland. They don't want them in Scotland, but they don't mind remaining a member of NATO. So there are some discrepancies as to what people understand by NATO. After all, British nuclear weapons were assigned to NATO. So there's not enough understanding of what NATO is all about, I think. I don't see NATO as being anything other than just really a tool of the United States, I guess. And of course, the United States already had nuclear weapons in Europe as a consequence of NATO in the nuclear sharing countries, and also had some in this country up until fairly recently, but they seem to have been removed. Can I just quickly say something about the missile defense system? I believe the Russians had said that they have a system that can go through any missile defense system, whether they're referring to hypersonic missiles, which travel at a very fast speed, or whether they're referring to a missile which can actually move in the last stages of its trajectory, so therefore making it much more difficult to target and pinpoint. They do say that they have those kind of missiles. I don't know how true that is. There's certainly some truth in the hypersonic missile systems. And also just to say that the City Council campaign here in Britain, I think in just a few weeks or months ago, Manchester was one of the first cities in Europe, I believe, to pass a resolution supporting the nuclear ban treaty and encouraging the government to participate in signing it. So, and we're working on campaigns to bring the same kind of resolution to as many cities in Britain as we can muster citizens who will take it to them. So, yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Alan has raised a relevant point, which he put in the chat box, but I wonder, Tony, can we call on Alan for a brief comment, and then we'll come back to Pavel.
Thank you, Jackie. So just again, in answer to the question about what can you do with your councillors and mayors, the appeal that we drafted this week was drafted by leaders of Mayors for Peace Europe and PND, that's Parliamentarians for Nuclear Disarmament in Europe. And so you can invite your councillors or mayors to sign, endorse the appeal. And I'll put the link to the appeal there, and endorsements can come to us at pnd.org. We're collating the endorsements, and then, as you'll see on the appeal, we're going to be sending it to the leaders of US and Russia, plus also the congressional committees and the Duma committee. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alan. That was an important reminder. Okay, back to you, Pavel, to answer the question about the
about the
claims about nuclear
claims.
capability.
Well, yes, back in March last year, President Putin revealed the whole range of kind of a new exotic systems that Russia apparently is working on, and some of them seem to be closer to deployment than others. So there is truth in that Russia is working on something new. Whether it's, in some cases, it's not particularly new. For example, this hypersonic missile, it's a project that started like 30 years ago. And in some cases, they're old ideas kind of that were taken off the shelf where they were lost for 40 plus years. And it's just, so I would just say that in terms of the kind of a military capability, the systems don't really add anything or change any kind of a balance or something like that. But they are a good illustration of the fact that you, once you get into the territory where basically there are no constraints and there are no pressure, there is no pressure on the governments, then you could see all kind of crazy stuff kind of being developed and deployed, and putting that kind of a back into the tube could be pretty difficult. So I think there is a danger of that by losing that treaty, losing the arms control framework, we will enable all kind of developments that some of which are fairly dangerous in terms of they bring new risks, and those risks are more difficult to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pavel. So before we close, I just want to make sure, are there any other comments from Andy or Regina?
I have a brief comment.
Okay.
You know, I would note that our discussion in the questions remains focused on nuclear weapons and the treaty, which is appropriate for this webinar. But again, I would note that we are doing this work in the context of a developing and likely intensifying much broader global political crisis. And again, that this crisis is engendering the emergence of a variety of movements. And so, you know, at the same time, we are quite rightly responding to this important issue. Again, we have to stave off disaster while we're making the space to build the movements. I would encourage people to be really thinking about how do we start those conversations with those other emerging movements about what the fundamental connections are between our work and really addressing the causes of war, which also are the causes of many of the injustices and dangers that others are working against. And by doing so, really reduce the risk of war in the near term and start creating the kind of world where elimination of nuclear weapons might be possible.
Thank you, Andy. Regina, do you have a last comment?
Yes, and I guess it follows up nicely with what Andy just said. We should never forget who are the profiteers of what's going on at the moment. The profiteers of the ballistic missiles, the profiteers of the nuclear warheads, the profiteers of all this missile defense stuff and all the other armament buildup that goes on with it. It's not us, it's not the health system, it's not the environment, it's not the climate, but it's the military-industrial complex. That's what it is. Or the military-industrial scientific whatever complex. So when we forget why is there such a heated build up at the moment, maybe we want to remind ourselves occasionally that there are actually companies and individuals making huge profits from that. And they have opened doors to people like US President Trump, but unfortunately also to many other leaders of defense departments, foreign ministries, and governments. So, I mean, our adversary is huge.
Okay, on that challenging note, I want to thank our presenters again. Really excellent presentations, a lot of food for thought and food for action. We will be sending everybody who registered a link to the recording and supporting materials. All of this will also be posted on the Abolition 2000 website. And if anybody is going to be in New York for the Non-Proliferation Treaty Preparatory Committee meeting, which is April 29th through May 10th, the Abolition 2000 annual general meeting will be on May 5th in New York. And we'll be sending out information about that as well. So again, and thanks to all of the participants from various parts of the world for your participation, and we look forward to doing more of these. So thank you very much.